Hello and everyone. Welcome to everyone who is joining us for this session on FAIR4RS software at the Research Data Alliance Virtual Plenary 17 meeting. We'll just wait for people to join before starting and doing a few introductions and housekeeping. Hello to everyone who's just joining us. This is the FAIR4RS software session at RDA Virtual Plenary 17. We'll just wait for people to join this session and then we'll get started with some introductions and housekeeping before going on to present the work of the FAIR4RS software working group. You'll see that we have a collaborative notes document and copies of this slide, which Paula has kindly posted links to in the chat. So if you want to follow along, please do go and have a little look at the slides. And if you go along into the collaborative notes document, we'll be doing a number of different participatory exercises during the session using this document. So please do check that you can access the collaborative notes. Welcome everyone. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. We'll just wait for more people to be joining us. And this is the FAIR4RS software session at RDA Virtual Plenary 17. We're posting in the chat the links to the collaborative notes for this session, as well as links to the slides. In the collaborative notes, you'll see that there's going to be a number of places where you'll be entering in some information, and we've also got some places to allow you to leave feedback at the end. If you want to find out more about the working group and its work, you can take a look at the links to the RDA group page and also our GitHub repository. If you're interested in getting involved, and also if you're interested in finding out what other events we have around the FAIR4RS software principles, please do take a look at the information under the How to Get Involved section in the collaborative notes and take a look at what events we're running. Okay. We'll get started now. My name is Neil Chuhong. I'm one of the members of the FAIR4RS software working group, which is a joint working group between the Research Data Alliance, the Research Software Alliance, and the Force 11 communities. FAIR4RS software is around understanding how we translate the FAIR principles for their use and implementation for software. And in this session, what we're going to be doing is updating you on the work of the FAIR4RS software working group, go through some of the draft software principles that we have been developing, and letting you know what the roadmap is for community feedback, consultation, and taking the FAIR4RS software principles further. A little bit of housekeeping, first of all. As I mentioned, the collaborative notes are where we're going to be doing a lot of the participatory sessions in this in this particular session. And we also have a link to the slides if you want to follow along as well and are looking for the slides in a larger format. This session comes under the RDA Code of Conduct. Please do make sure that you've read this. In particular, we ask that participants stay in listen-only mode unless you're asking a direct question. Add your questions in the Q&A and comments in the chat instead of unmuting. If you have specific questions for people who are speaking, or you have resources that you want to share, you can add these into the collaborative notes. Please be aware that this session is being recorded and it's going to be made publicly available to RDA plenary attendees. And if you want to see the slides in full screen, you can click the expand button located in the bottom right of the Juno interface. So, first of all, welcome to this session. Thank you very much for showing an interest in the FAIR for Research software principles. I'm going to, at various points, introduce other members of the working group who are going to be showing off the work that they've been leading. But to start with, what we're going to ask you to do is to take a look at the collaborative notes, and you'll see that there's a section for participants there. So if you'd like to take 30 seconds just to fill out your name and details in there, you'll be able to see the other people who are participating in this meeting. So I'll just give you a little bit of time. If you want to navigate through the collaborative notes, you'll find that there's links up at the top. You can also choose to, in Google Docs, to use the View and Show Document outline to add a navigation bar on the left-hand side of the document. And I can see that people are putting in their names just now. So whilst people are doing that, I will continue on to give you a little bit of an overview of the session. So today's session, what we're going to be doing is reviewing the FAIR for Research software working group activity. The different leads will be talking about some of the work that's been done in the initial subgroups that's taken place since the last plenary meeting. We'll also update you on the process of the first community consultation and the drafting sessions that have followed. Then we're going to present an early draft of the FAIR Principles for Research software and discuss some key questions that we're looking to get feedback from participants. We'll take some time to present the next steps for how we're going to take forward these principles and the way that you can provide feedback as part of the different community processes. And then finally, we're going to outline the wider road ahead for the FAIR for Research software working group. So I'll start, though, by kind of just describing the rough break-up of this session. So we're going to go on to an icebreaker next. We'll spend the first third of the meeting talking about the activity of the working groups. We'll spend the second 30 minutes looking at the draft FAIR principles and asking you some questions. And then finally, we'll spend the last third of the session talking about the next steps for the FAIR for Research software principles consultation, as well as talking about the road ahead and the different methods of engagement that we'll be using and that we're looking to get your feedback on as well. So a quick introduction to FAIR for Research software. As I mentioned, it's a joint working group between the 3 different organizations. And what we're doing is coordinating a range of existing community-led discussions on how to apply FAIR principles to research software. We'll also be talking about how we achieve adoption of these principles, and the roadmap for this will be described later on by Michelle Barker in a pre-recorded video. If you're interested in finding out what the case statement is, you can find it on the link that's being shared on this slide. So the motivation for this work is that the FAIR principles were always intended to apply to all digital objects. What we're looking to do is focus on how we adapt these FAIR principles to research software, and also what the challenges might be to adoption of the FAIR principles for research software. Since the original FAIR Principles paper was published, there have been a number of other reports that have come out that recommend different things that will help us understand how we adapt and adopt the FAIR Principles to research software. Two examples include the FAIR Practice Task Force of the European Open Science Cloud, which, as one of its 6 recommendations for the implementation of FAIR practice, asked us to recognize that FAIR guidelines will require translation for other digital objects, including software. And also an opportunity note by the French National Committee for Open Science, which noted that it was important that the specific nature of software is recognized and not considered as just data. And this is the key work of the FAIR for Research Software Working Group. It's to understand what the difference is between data and software and how that affects the implementation of principles. So, as our first exercise for you as participants, what we'd like you to do is identify who you expect to apply FAIR and why. So in the collaborative notes, there is a section on the icebreaker part of the document where you can write your answer to those 2 questions. And what I'm going to do is just get you to take a minute to try and fill out these answers. And really, it will help us get an understanding of the people that you're working with, who you think will need to apply the FAIR principles, and the reasons why you think they will need to apply those FAIR principles. So if you'd like to start looking at that, I will take a little look at what your answers are as well. And obviously, if you find that there's not enough space, feel free to add some more space at the bottom. It may be a little bit chaotic with Google Docs. We've got a large number of participants just now, but it looks like you're all doing fine just now. Okay, so just now, in terms of the people that you expect to be applying FAIR, there's a lot of emphasis on both researchers and also on software developers. And I think this kind of is a key thing that's coming across in terms of it's the creators of the work who are looking to be applying FAIR, so the creators of the software. A lot of people are also noting that it applies to lots of other different types of creators of data, creators more generally of research and research outputs. And I think there's also another category that's coming up in some of the comments, which is around people who are publishing research and the requirements to make sure that the software that's included there is referenced. I can also see references to people who are involved in the different scholarly infrastructures and things like repositories and registries. And also there are now some things coming up around the people who might be involved in the curation process, the data stewards. So this is all really interesting because I think it points to one of the things that, as we've been developing the FAIR research principles for software, we've been aware of, in that there are different user groups and stakeholders for FAIR. And one of the challenges here is understanding for research software, who are the primary stakeholders. So I'm going to go on. If you want to keep on adding in answers into your icebreaker, please feel free to do that. But I'm going to move on so that we can start talking about the work of the working group and how we have got to these draft set of principles. So this is going to be a set of short presentations by the different working group leads. There's not a presentation on the FAIR work in other contexts for this session because this group has wrapped up already. If you're interested in finding out more about that work, we have included some of the work in the slides that we're circulating, and also you can look back at the previous RDA P16 notes and talks to find out more about that work. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Dan Katz to talk a little bit about the first subgroup's work, which was looking at a fresh look for FAIR for research software.
All right, thank you. So our group, as it says in the title, took a fresh look. And by fresh, we really mean that we didn't use work that had been done previously. And in particular, we did not read or pay attention to a paper from Annalena Lambrecht. So we went back to the FAIR principles themselves, the FAIR data principles, and we looked at each of the principles, tried to decide, does it apply to software or not, under what conditions, what are the issues. All of this discussion led to a report that's published on arXiv and an opinion piece that we published in Patterns. And the results, more or less, were that findable and accessible were fairly clear, and we understood what those meant, and that it wasn't too different than data. But interoperable and reusable were fairly unclear, both in definition as they apply to software and then the details, actually. And we also found a large number of gaps in terms of current practices and ecosystems, things like how does software metadata get recorded? What's the right metadata? How do repositories fit into this? Do we have the right set of repositories? So overall, we tried to put this in the context of some high-level goals, and that's really that we believe that all research software should be high quality and robust, and that all research should be reproducible. And we view FAIR as one step in this direction, and that's what this kind of set of images shows, is that by making software fair, we move somewhere along this path, but we don't actually get there. FAIR is not the end goal, it's just a step that makes things better than they are now. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And I think you got quite a lot of thumbs up for that last bit that you mentioned there. So next, we're going to go on to subgroup 3, which was about defining research software, and I'll hand over to Moran.
Hi, thank you, Neil, and hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm not sure, but if you can, please, if you can't, please tell me. So we have, well, our goal was to clarify the scope of the working group. So we try to have a research software definition to see which objects are or should be the ones considered for the FAIR for research software principles. We had a few calls and 2 workshops and debated very interesting subject on those calls and on documents. Now we have a summary report that's under community review of the full working group. The community review is done on the 26th of April. I'm going to put in the chat the link to the document, so you're welcome to also join this review. What we did find that there's a real controversy of what we do consider research software. Different disciplines consider research software different things. So we have identified an important distinction between an inclusive definition and an exclusive definition, where when you think of an inclusive definition, it will be all software that is used in research with some kind of small differences. And for an exclusive, the exclusive definition is really research software that was created during research and has a very important impact on science and on research. So this is the controversy, and you're welcome to come and contribute to the document community review. Back to you, Neil.
Thank you very much, Moran. I'm going to now go on and talk about subgroup 4. And subgroup 4 was looking at new research related to FAIR software. So the aim of this group was to review both recent research and studies that have been going on to do with FAIR and FAIR in practice, and also to re-examine the paper that Dan mentioned, the Towards FAIR Principles for Research Software by Annalena Lamprecht et al., and take a look and see whether any of the work that's been done since that paper was published allows us to read the decisions made in that in a different light. So the principal thing that this group did was to run a survey to get feedback on these rewritten FAIR principles and to gather examples of how people perceive the application of FAIR principles to software. And so if you're interested in reading a little bit more, there's a draft report that is being developed there for this working group, and two other things, which are a reading list of new research in this area and also examples of fair and unfair software and why people felt these were fair and unfair. However, the main thing that came out of this work was a number of issues again. I think in each of the subgroups, our key output was understanding the different types of issues that were raised by looking at a different aspect of the FAIR principles. And so things that came up include recursion and how much fair objects require the objects that they're depending on to be fair. Things like long-term availability of objects and whether software is fair if it's not available for a long time. Relationships and understanding who's responsible for how these are recorded. And also things like uniformity. So the fact that it might be different applying FAIR to something which is written as a quick script to convert some data versus a production platform that is used by many hundreds of people. So all of these kind of things fed into some of the future work, and in particular into a community consultation, which Paula is going to talk about.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep, you loud and clear, Paula.
Thank you. In February 2021, a document was created to compare the difference identified by the 4 subgroups because they work independently. And also we compared the Lamprecht et al. Paper and the 5 recommendations for FAIR software. Dan Katz and Neil Chuhon led this document creation, reviewed the findings, and highlight some questions that were put up for community consultation. We had a period of 2 weeks where the FAIR4RS working group was invited to review this document, and also other groups in RDA that might be interested in the development of the FAIR principles for research software. We are happy that we've received a large number of comments from the community. We have identified 19 contributors outside of the steering committee. There was a very live discussion and focus on clarifying the wording of the document and the intent of the principles. This consultation is now published on Zenodo, and it is the main input for the drafting sprint that Neil's going to explain in a moment.
Thank you very much, Paula. So at this point, I'm just going to quickly stop and remind people of the Q&A function in Juno. So if you have any questions about the initial work of the subgroups or the community consultation phase, please do put them in the Q&A just now. What I'll do is I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about the process that we took to get to this first draft of the FAIR for Research Software Principles that we'll present to you in a few minutes. But if you do have questions on the initial work of the subgroups, please let us know by putting them in the Q&A, and then we'll take a little bit of time to answer that just before we go on to the draft principles. So, as Paula said, the work that was done by the subgroups and also the work and feedback that was surfaced by the first community consultation was taken forward by a small task force that was looking at all of the different issues that had been raised by this different work. What we did was we met over the course of 5 meetings in April 2021, so it's been the last 3 or 4 weeks. And what we aimed to do was taking the original intent of the FAIR principles as a starting point. So specifically looking at the intent of FAIR to maximize the added value gained by contemporary formal scholarly digital publishing, and also to ensure transparency, reproducibility, and reusability of research and research objects. We also wanted to acknowledge that the foundational principles of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible might not fit directly if applied in the same way that they were applied for the data principles. What we wanted to do was make sure we stayed true to the goals of the FAIR principles, but make sure that they are applicable to software. There are also some cases where we recognize that the way that they were applied for data, in hindsight, now that there's been a few years of trying to apply the FAIR principles, might not necessarily have been phrased in the right way for data either. So we were on the lookout for any places where there could be improvements to the way that either the principle or the explanatory text could be phrased. In general, the feedback that was received from the first community consultation identified that the key challenges were about finding the balance between general, more abstract principles that capture the ethos of FAIR versus specific principles that point to the means of implementation. So we have this challenge in that if we make something too specific, it may not apply to every community. But if we make something too general, it becomes hard to understand how to implement in any one community. The other key challenge, as I've alluded to, is that we have to make a decision about sticking closely to the FAIR data principles or reinterpreting the FAIR ethos for software. So we've made a number of key assumptions, one of which is kind of going back to your answers from the icebreaker question. So the first was that the application of the FAIR principles is the responsibility of the owner, often the creator of the software, and not the users. So it is the person who's developing the software to whom the FAIR principles, we're looking for the developer to be applying the FAIR principles and trying to make their software fair, not the user of the software. So not the person who might be putting a piece of software into the methodology section. Another key assumption, which is sort of looking also at the work of subgroup 3, is that principles can be applied to any software used in research. Although, as Moran has said, we still need to look closely at this discussion, and this is one of the key questions we're going to be asking you later is related to a particular aspect of what is or isn't software used in research. And lastly, an assumption is that software has a wide range of useful lifetimes. So what we mean by this is that not all software will have the same lifetime. It will vary from community to community. It will differ based on purpose, and it will also differ based on the sort of maturity of the software. That shouldn't be an excuse to apply FAIR to software, even though we expect findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability to degrade over time. So it is entirely appropriate to make your software fair, knowing that without maintenance, it will become less fair as time goes on. So those are the challenges and assumptions that, that we started off with. I'm now going to go and talk about the FAIR principles themselves, but I'm just going to check the chat to see whether or not, I don't see any questions on the earlier process, so I'm just going to go forward. If you do have questions about any of the processes that we've used up till now, feel free to put those in the Q&A. Okay, so I see there's one question that's come up saying, regarding the first assumption, ultimately, especially the machine actionable parts of the software like persistent identifier, metadata access standards, etc., depend heavily on the repository the software is curated in. So repositories have to offer the technical capabilities. Yeah, so specifically looking at that, one of the things that the drafting groups looked at was the balance between the FAIR software principles being aspirational versus there being support in the infrastructure for doing certain things. And you'll see eventually when we release the full next stage consultation that there are still some questions related to this and the balance we have around things like relationships of identifiers and so on. In software lifetime, yeah, so this question should be considered together with data lifetime or research lifetime. I think that's a very valid point that that person has made, and I think it's also tied to a question that we're going to ask you to give your opinion on around how the FAIR software principles relate to the other FAIR principles. So you'll get a chance to answer something on that as well. And software lifetime is also linked to the question about what has been considered as research software. Yes, that's a very good point as well. And I think we'll cover a little bit about that in a moment. So I'm going to move on now and present what we believe are the first draft of FAIR Principles for Research Software coming out of this group. And I'm not going to be asking you at this stage to comment directly on the principles. What I will describe a little bit later is the process that we're going to be using to get your feedback, because at a session like this, it's very hard to kind of take in all of the principles and provide direct feedback. If you do have questions about the sort of assumptions or the decisions that may have come in to any of these principles, please do put them in the Q&A, and we'll take some time to go through them. But we may reserve the right to take this forward as part of the wider consultation process and ask you to submit it into the documents that we'll be using for that, so that it's recorded rather than it just being part of this plenary session. So overall, we find that the FAIR principles for research software are, on the whole, similar to those for data, but there are some things which are substantially changed in the way that they're applied, rather than the sort of ethos of the FAIR principles. So looking at findable, we think that the FAIR principles for research software are defining findable as the software and its associated metadata should be easy to find for both humans and computers, that software is assigned a globally unique and persistent identifier, that software is described with rich metadata, that the metadata clearly and explicitly include the identifier of the software they describe, and that software is registered or indexed in a researchable resource. And if you're familiar with the FAIR data principles, you'll see that those are effectively the same principles, but with data changed to software, with the exception of the third principle there, which is still applying to metadata. You'll see there's a bit of green text in there, and that is potential additions to the wording of these principles that we will ask the community to provide feedback on, which we feel may make the intent of the principle and the scope of the principle a little bit clearer. So I think one thing that we have looked at in the drafting sessions is how the references to metadata and where it's used are spread across the different principles. Under accessible, we think that accessible for software is that the software and its metadata must be retrievable via standardized protocols. And here again, these principles are similar to the data ones. So that is, software is retrievable by its identifier using a standardized communications protocol. The protocol is open, free, and universally implementable. And the protocol allows for an authentication and authorization procedure where necessary. That the metadata are accessible even when the software is no longer available. And here again, we're using the sort of broader view of these principles that can also be applied to data, in that these protocols and procedures may include things like embargo periods or non-disclosure agreements and so on. Where we found that the principles for software change from the principles for data is more around interoperable and reusable. So for interoperable, we are redefining this as the software interoperates with other software through exchanging data and or metadata and or interaction via application programming interfaces. And the reasoning here is that for data, the way that interoperable is defined is it's around the integration of existing data sets to create new data sets. Whereas we think that interoperability for software is around the exchange of data and the ability to do that, and the ability to interact with different pieces of software and other objects. So here we've defined two principles. One is that software reads, writes, and exchanges data in a way that meets domain relevant community standards. And the second is that software includes qualified references to other objects. And that second principle is similar to the one in the data principles. For reusable, we've looked more at the way that usability and reusability are defined in the software world. And we're saying that we think that for the FAIR principles, reusable for software means that the software is both usable, as in it can be executed, and reusable, as in it can be understood, modified, built upon, or incorporated into other software. And so that's one thing where there is a little bit of overlap between interoperable and reusable. And so we've defined the following principles for reusable: that software is richly described with plurality of accurate and relevant attributes, that software is made available with a clear and accessible license, that software is associated with detailed provenance, software includes qualified references to other software, and software meets domain relevant community standards. So I see there's been a few questions coming in. So Paul has asked, would R2 incorporate information, re the environment, hard and soft required to reuse the software? So that is a really good question. So we have split apart what was in the data principles as data includes qualified references to other data into these two different principles, I2 and R2, to reflect the fact that we think that there's two separate purposes for including qualified references to other objects. For interoperability, it's more around the formats and the ability to exchange data, whereas, as you point out, Paul, for reusability, it may be around the broader definition of dependencies. And so I think we certainly have a question in the consultation document, and I can't remember now whether we have one that we're going to be asking you in this session. But it is a good point that that's something that's different in terms of reuse of software versus reuse of data. I'm just trying to see if, so yeah, so how is domain defined? Is it scientific domain and so on? That's a really good question as well. We are going to be asking you a question directly in the next part of this session on what you believe domain means here, and particularly what is domain relevant community standard. Okay, so there's a question on versioning and whether version is thought of as differently with respect to data. So in the drafting sprints, this was something which came up again and again as to whether there was something specific around the nature of software that made versioning more important. I think this is something where we're still looking to get some feedback on. It's noted that for data and software, both have different, sort of similar and overlapping requirements for versioning, and also places where they're different. But it feels more that perhaps the versioning it's the sort of way that it's applied and implemented. So we're not yet sure whether this is something that should be explicitly enshrined in the principles, and that's why, for instance, in F1 there's this thing about whether effectively the identifier infrastructure should explicitly support the assignment of versions, because it's something that is valuable to all software. Or whether this should be more like it is with data, and acknowledge that versions are there, but this becomes more about guidance for how you might implement this. Okay, I'm just trying to see, have we got any other questions here? So we've got one also around, do we have to recommend specialized software repositories? So this is a good question. I think this is partly the reason why the last F4 is phrased as is registered or indexed in the searchable resource. And this speaks to the kind of challenges that I mentioned earlier around aspirational versus what might be available in the infrastructure, and also around making it general enough so that the intent is clear, but making it specific enough to be implementable. So this is an area where I think it would be useful to have some discussion and some feedback here. For instance, I would be personally very interested to find out from people if, for instance, you think F4, software is registered or indexed in a searchable resource, would be fulfilled by the code being in a version control repository that has a search engine facility for it. Okay, and there is a question around research software interacts with research data. An important feature of research software should be how it could ingest FAIR data and how FAIR is the output. Yes, that's another really good point. And I think one of the key challenges that we had, which I think we're not going to ask you today, is basically how far down the stack do you have to go to be fair, to ensure, so how much do inputs and outputs need to be fair for the thing in the middle, the software, to be fair itself? And so we think that's certainly around the sorts of formats and data that are directly around it, but obviously software has many more dependencies than data. Oh, and one question here is, have you discussed your principles with the original authors of the FAIR principles? Some of the original authors of the FAIR principles have been involved in the feedback, particularly the community consultations, but we will be going back out to them again. One of the things that's been really interesting, for instance, is we were looking at why in the FAIR principles there's one specific principle which is phrased slightly differently, and effectively, rather than it being data and metadata, it's been metadata and data, and it appears that that is simply a typo in the original principles. So we have been getting in touch with particularly Mark Wilkinson to get a sense of what was in the minds, what was the intent of the authors of the original FAIR principles, to make sure that we're keeping close to that intent. Okay, I see there are other questions coming up. I'm going to stop just now, and I'm going to go forward onto some of the questions that we have for you, so that it's not just me talking and answering, but instead I'm going to go forward and get you to answer some of the questions that we have, which are still requiring input from the community. So these key questions are again going to be in the collaborative notes, and what we have is we have some space in there for some key questions. For my fellow co-chairs, it may be that we need to extend the size of the tables here, just so that we know we've got enough space. So if you're able to keep a watch on that, that would be really great. But I'm going to be asking you 4 or 5 questions, depending on the amount of time we have. The first one is around what we mean by domain relevant community standards. And so that's something that one of the people in the Q&A brought up. So we see that we mentioned domain relevant community standards in a couple of places around interoperable and reusable. So we would like you to let us know what the term domain relevant community standard means to you, and also whether you can describe the kinds of criteria you would use to understand whether something was a domain relevant community standard. So what are the things that you're looking for that give you greater confidence that it fits this term? So if you could go into the collaborative notes document, and you'll see that there is a table there for the first question. Find yourself a blank space on that table and start putting out your answers. Okay, so taking a quick look through the answers we've got. So one thing that's coming up a lot from people is around whether or not existing organizations are kind of recognized by the community and whether they're producing standards. Others are around standard data formats that are used, and it sounds like for those, a lot of it is community consensus on data. And a lot of people are talking about domains being research domains and sort of sub-communities of research. In some cases, one or two people are saying that they're not necessarily sure whether there are standards already applicable to software in their communities. And I think this is one of the challenges where whilst there may be a choice of common data formats for exchange of data, there may not be the same for even things like what programming languages or what techniques are most common. So some people are kind of like asking questions of the question around how you define domain. So I think in this case, this is maybe best seen as from the perspective of the person who's choosing to apply the FAIR principles, because I think that's the primary stakeholder. But it might also be around the people who'll be looking and seeing whether they believe something that they're using is meeting the FAIR principles. So I think there's a secondary stakeholder there as well, which is the potential users of software that is being declared FAIR. So it's interesting. So some people are kind of putting in the concept of being widely adopted or widely used, and also around support. So that's a really interesting one, in that it's both support as in the standards are being maintained, but also that it is supported by things like infrastructure in the community, or indeed software. It looks like in some cases there are communities which are really far ahead here, and that they even have compliance checkers that let you help understand whether the things are following domain relevant community standards. I think that's probably the gold standard that all communities are looking to get to. Okay, I'll give you another 30 seconds or so to fill out answers here, because I think all of the things that people are providing are really useful input into helping us decide how to phrase this. One of the things that came up in the original, the first community consultation that we put out earlier this year, is that the clarity of the language was really important, and that a lot of the kind of issues that people felt might come about were around not being able to understand how to either interpret or implement a principle. And I think domain relevant community standards is a really good example of this. Whilst I don't think we should be specifying particular standards as part of the FAIR principles, I think it's important for us to give clarity of language so that people are able to interpret this for their own fields. Okay, I still see typing going on, so I'll give you another 30 seconds. I think one thing that I'm noticing, which is really nice, is that the range of participants here are from a wide range of different domains, and also in terms of it sounds like the kinds of roles you're in as well. So this is good. This is kind of making sure that we get enough input into this from a wide variety of people and a wide cross section of the space. Okay, I'll let you continue filling out this. If you have more to add, feel free to add this at any time into the document. But what I'm going to do now is move on to the next question, which is around effectively part of the definition of what is included or excluded in software. So Moran talked about a number of the other issues to do with the definition of software. But specifically for this session, what we're interested is understanding whether the application of the principle of accessible, so whether something is a piece of software is retrievable, should be expanded to include instances of software running as services or as platforms that people are accessing. So what we'd like you to answer now in the next table in the notes is whether you think this is in or out of scope, and giving your reason why you think it's in or out of scope. So do you think that instances of software running as services or platforms should be included in the general set of software that the FAIR for Research software principles apply to? And why do you think this? I should have also mentioned that the way that you'll see that one of the columns says name or identifier, we're very happy for you to be anonymous if you want to. Just use the same identifier for your different answers so we can match up answers between the different questions. I should say that I'm particularly interested in the answer to this question because I realized during the drafting sessions that I am the minority view amongst the drafting team for this question. Oh, this is really interesting. So looking at the initial flow of the answers, there is quite a lot of difference in the opinion here. There are answers. There are some answers going yes. There are some answers going no. There are some answers going unsure. But also the reasons that people are giving have quite a wide spread of opinion. So I think this is clearly something where we need to probably kind of go back and revisit this in the light of the work that Moran has been leading and giving some more evidence so that people can provide us with more feedback on where they think the line should be drawn. So I see there's something people sort of saying that they're finding it a little bit difficult to understand how to answer this question. I have left it deliberately a bit vague, partly because when we look at the way that data is the accessibility of data is defined, we have this interesting thing of a different way in which we see the interaction to make data accessible. So effectively, data is somewhere, and then you're retrieving it from there. And so for software, at one end, you've got the obvious analogy, which is that the source code is available to be retrieved from somewhere. But more broadly, software, we're not talking about FAIR for research source code. We're talking about FAIR for research software. So it's about understanding almost what your idea of accessible is, and then that will help you understand whether or not you think instances of software are the same sort of thing. It's kind of going back to the original ethos of FAIR, whether you think that's required for transparency, reproducibility, reusability, and whether or not it is sensible to have this in or out of scope. Okay, I think people are mostly now finished on this question. Do take a little look over some of the other answers that people have given, because I think here this is a really great example of a question where everyone has something to learn from the other opinions of people. If you do have any comments or you have an agreement with a piece of thing, you can also put in a comment in the document or add a +1 to it if you think this is something that it's important for someone to highlight. It will also make it easier for us to identify the key points that you think we should definitely be considering as we go forward in the revision of these principles and the explanatory text. Okay, I'm going to go forward to the next question, which is around references to other objects. So again, I'll ask you to fill this out in the notes. So what types of objects must software be able to interact with and therefore need to be referenced? So can you provide examples of these different types of objects? And the thing that we're really looking to get a sense of is, should the references to these objects be part of interoperability, of reusability, or actually are they shared between both because they have slightly different purposes? And this is back to the discussion that I mentioned earlier around the principles I2 and R2 about qualified references to other objects and other software. And what we're looking to understand is there a clear difference, in which case there should be a principle in both interoperability and in reusability, or is one really a subset of the other? whilst people are talking, I think there was one comment that I saw that hadn't been answered in the Q&A that was deleted or removed. And it was a comment around the fact, I think, that the FAIR principles are maybe not necessarily in the hands of the original authors. I think that's a good point to make, and that FAIR is now larger than the first document that was created by Mark Wilkinson and everyone else in that original set of discussions. And there is a wider question, I think, around FAIR governance and governance of the FAIR principles, which is bigger certainly than this working group and this meeting, but is certainly something that is coming up in other aspects of the Research Data Alliance work. So I think that's something that's really important to raise, and we'll be following it. But I don't think it's specifically something that we're able to handle just within the FAIR for Research Software working group. Okay. So someone's asked, could you go through the issue again on reusability and interoperability? So here, I think, if I'm getting you right, it was what I just described around this question 3, where what we're looking at is, for software, we have split the principles into one which is around qualified references to other objects, which is sitting under interoperability, and one which is around qualified references to other software, which is sitting under reusability. And we're really just looking to find out whether or not you think that both of these are valid and distinct, or whether you think one of these is effectively a subset of the other. So that, for instance, the bit that's coming under interoperability is really just required for reusability, or vice versa. Okay, this is also a really interesting one, where people are certainly coming up with a lot of good examples of different types of objects where we might need to have qualified references. Here, it's interesting because I think people are, depending on the way that they're looking at this, maybe dividing into two camps as to whether they think it's reusability or interoperability. So here, I think that's really interesting. I think basically your answers are showing that this is something that was requiring a little bit of feedback, and I suspect that we might need to do a little bit more when we are going through the consultation. There is, relatively speaking, though, it looks like a reasonable consensus that we should be looking at both. So that's useful to know. Okay, I'm aware that we're now getting towards the last part of this session. So I'm going to ask just one more question in this session, and I'll leave you to answer the last question on your own in your own time as we go through some of the other parts. So the last question that I'm going to move on to just now is around software granularity and identifiers. So here we currently say under findability that software is assigned a globally unique and persistent identifier. There's been some good work elsewhere, particularly in the in the work of the software source code identification working group to look at the different levels of granularity of software where identifiers can be applied. And so there's a picture here on this diagram, which I hope you can see, that is, which is around the different levels from project at the top down to files and code fragments at the bottom. So the question that we're asking you here is, firstly, should the FAIR principles for research software care about the levels of granularity that identifiers should be assigned to? So that's the first thing. Does this matter? If it does matter, if you think it matters, which are the most useful granularity levels to ensure the findability of software? So where should identifiers as implemented by FAIR software point to? Which granularity level should they point to ensure the findability of software? So here we're specifically looking at findability rather than the other FAIR principles. I think we may be about to hit the "you have too many people editing in the Google Doc at one time" limit. I can see something that's flashed up for me. So hopefully you're still able to edit. It's really interesting. So a lot of people are saying yes, this does matter, but some people are making the point that in many cases this might matter more for the people who are trying to find the software rather than the other stakeholders here. So that's a really interesting point. And also, I suspect what will be happening here is that also there's a slight difference of opinion about which levels we should be looking at here. Although I think it seems clear that it's around something to do. Some people are looking at it at levels required to effectively look at the reproducibility aspect of FAIR and its objectives. Some people to looking at it more at the, I guess, maybe the ability to retrieve it level. So what makes sense to retrieve? Hopefully there's not too much overwriting going on. I can see a little bit of I'm always worried a little bit when we're doing this about too much kind of being too much chaos going on in the Google Doc. At one of the other conferences that we ran, we specifically had a risk analysis done, which was the cat of one of the hosts of this would accidentally run across the keyboard and delete one of the active Google Docs we were using. Okay, I think we're starting to get like lots and lots of really useful input here. I think this one particularly, something that's interesting here is the use of the diagram clearly makes it easier for people to be able to scope down the question to what they're interested in. So that's something we'll take on board as something that is useful for phrasing some of the community feedback. Okay, I'm going to move on now in the interest of time, and I will say that there's one more question that you can answer if you want, which is around the relationship of FAIR for Research software to FAIR data principles. In particular, we're looking to get an understanding of whether or not the FAIR principles for research software should be standalone so that they can be read and implemented independently of knowledge of the FAIR data principles, with the drawback that we might be repeating part of the FAIR data principles, or whether we should remove the principles that are effectively just copied from the FAIR data principles. So particularly around the fairness of metadata, so that we're not duplicating, but that does require people to be able to read both the FAIR research software principles and the FAIR data principles together to understand the FAIR software principles. So if you're able to give an answer in that whilst we go through the rest of the session, please do again in the collaborative notes. But for now, I'm going to move on and go into the last sort of section on the next steps for FAIR for research software and the principles. So what's the consultation process going to be for the FAIR for research software principles? What you've been doing just now is effectively the very first stage of the community feedback. So your input will help us shape the way that we're going to be putting out the draft of the FAIR for Research Software Principles document as a consultation exercise. So thank you so much for this. I think the key thing that you're helping us do here is understand which are the things which there is a lot of differing opinions in the community where we need to be able to give a number of different options to choose between for the community to discuss. So what we're going to be doing, given the feedback we got from the first community consultation, is focusing on particular options that we may take and decisions for the FAIR principles for research software, as well as the clarity of the text. So the vast majority of the issues and feedback we got on the first one was around the way that you could or couldn't interpret the meaning and intent from the text of the principles and the explanatory text. So the process will be that we will be putting out a first full draft of the FAIR for Research software principles as a Google Doc for comments. This will be at the end of April. It's to be confirmed because after this meeting, we're going to be taking the input that you've provided and doing a few rewrites before we release it. We also need to complete the writing of some of the explanatory text, again, based in part on the comments that you've given us on some of the areas where we were still looking for input. There'll be some additional webinars similar to this one where we'll be going through things and asking some other key questions to other audiences. And then we'll have an open workshop, probably nearing the end of May, to discuss feedback on this first draft and to go through again the areas where we think there is still not a community consensus. Following that, we hope to publish the first full version 1 draft on the RDA website and call for a full formal community consultation. So that will be for a 1-month period. And in parallel, have consultations with the RESET and Force 11 communities on the same document so that we're getting feedback from a number of different stakeholder groups and audiences. Once that has all completed, assuming that the feedback we get is simply narrowing down and letting us know that we're on the right track, rather than saying that the FAIR for Research software principles don't work as written, we will move forward towards the publication of an endorsed first version of the FAIR for Research software principles. But that is really just the first challenge. So as people will be aware of the FAIR, as the same thing for the FAIR data principles, the principles are simply the starting point of the process. They're certainly not the end point. And what we're going to just go on to now is a last bit where I will virtually hand over to Michelle Barker, who's been leading the work on the FAIR for Research software roadmap, to talk about the road ahead and the engagement plan. So this is a pre-recorded video, and I will start this playing and then come back for any questions on it.
Hi everyone, I'm Michelle Barker, the Director of the Research Software Alliance, and I'll be talking for a few minutes on some of the things that we have upcoming for the next 6 months around community engagement. As you can see by this list, we have a number of events already confirmed for the rest of the year, and this list keeps updating. We're always open to new ideas. Please feel free to put in the notes suggestions of other events that we could present at. And we're also interested in talking to anyone who would like to co-present any kind of items at events. We have a workshop that we've already given a couple of times where we talk a bit about FAIR4RS, and then a local community, perhaps a national group or a disciplinary group or a software community with particular interest talks about their focus. And then we generate some discussion with all the participants about how FAIR could be advanced in this community, where there's already some great best practice examples, and what else needs to be done. When we've achieved the milestone of finalising the FAIR4RS principles in the middle of this year, then we'll turn our attention to adoption guidelines. Now, we aim to work with existing guidelines, and these are some examples of existing work that have a FAIR software focus or another aspect of software that encompasses FAIR, or some FAIR data focus that could be extended to software. There are many more that could be listed here, and we'd really like to hear from you if you are the owner or the facilitator of one of these types of guidelines and would like to partner with us to extend your work to include the updated FAIR for Research software principles. Whilst we do the work on adoption guidelines, we'll also be starting to set up some use cases. We'd like to have some use cases of adoption of the FAIR principles at national levels, disciplinary, funder, and individual software projects. And again, we're looking for examples or volunteers to step forward who'd like to work with us on that. It does give you an opportunity to get the benefits of early adoption, to be a leader in your field. So we'd love to hear from you if you'd like to work with us to encourage and incentivize the adoption of the FAIR principles in your community, and to measure how well that goes so that those learnings can be shared more broadly throughout the research software community. My organisation, the Research Software Alliance, is also leading a project called the FAIR4RS Roadmap, which outlines how to make FAIR research software a reality. There's one thing we can learn from the last 5 years of applying the FAIR principles to research data, is that there's many pieces of work are needed to be done to make it a reality. So the FAIR4RS roadmap aims to map in advance the existing work that's being done, where there are gaps, and start things off, to create a longer term strategic framework so we have some coordination early on to guide further investment. And as part of that, we need to identify potential collaborators and leads. So we're initiating some work around that at the moment. We have a working group already formed to think about FAIR research software metrics, and another one starting up now on FAIR4RS implementation in the life sciences, using Elixir as the main pilot. There's others under discussion: FAIR for research software curriculum or skills, metadata and interoperability, infrastructure and services, governance. So also interested to hear from you if you'd like to be involved in any of those. Finally, to re-emphasize, we really value your involvement. This is a community effort, and the more community that we have giving input and feedback and contributing to the work to develop the principles and the subsequent work to adopt them and develop, to apply them in different use cases, is what brings value to this group. So there's a whole list of options here. You can engage with us in any way, from simply subscribing to our newsletter or reading some of our outputs, right through to collaborating on the work that we're doing. And all of that information is detailed on our community engagement channels page. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Michelle Barker, the Director of the Research.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you everyone who is starting to fill out some information for possible places that we should be engaging with your community or with other communities. So I'd just like to reiterate what Michelle said and say that we're really interested in finding out what other events would benefit from FAIR for Research software workshops. So if there are any events that you regularly go to that you think would benefit from a FAIR workshop, particularly if you can help us discuss with the organizers whether a FAIR for Research software workshop would fit in with that event, please do add it in the space in today's notes at the end, and I'll give you a minute or so to add those in. As well as this, as Michelle said, we're interested in understanding if we can partner with your organization to help enable consultations around adoption in your community. So again, if you have any possible leads there, please do put those into the document and we will follow up with you on those and see how we can best ensure that your organization and your community are taken forward in this process of implementing and adopting the FAIR for Research software principles. Okay, I'm going to give now, as we're coming to the end of our session, a final chance for people to put in any questions and answers, any questions they have around what's been presented as a whole, or indeed the work of the FAIR for Research software working group. I'll reiterate what Michelle said about the different ways in which you can get involved. In particular, if you want to make sure that you are made aware of the next consultation exercise where we're trying to get community feedback on the draft, please make sure that you have joined the RDA group. It doesn't cost you anything to join. All you need to do is sign up on the group page and then you'll become part of the mailing list. If you really don't want to be part of the mailing list, but you do want to be informed, then please make sure you are at least part of the RDA as a member and keep a lookout on the group pages for the announcements. Please do, once you've told us where we should be going to send events, to come along to events, and as you kind of go forward, make sure that you're looking at the community engagement channels page, which is where we list all of the different ways in which we are going out to the community. And that community really isn't just us going out to you. I think it's also you coming into us. As everyone has said, we're really keen to make sure that people become an active part of this community in the ways that they want to. And so please do feel free to engage with us or ask us questions, or indeed raise the issues that you have which are really important for you or your part of your community. Okay, so I see there's a question there around whether there will be a discussion of the metrics working group during the plenary. There's not going to be this time round. We would expect that probably to be at the next plenary, as this group is just getting started. If you are interested in understanding the work of the metrics working group, please do get in touch with us directly, and or put a little note in the collaborative document just now saying that you'd like someone to get in touch, and we will put you in touch with the people who are starting to lead this work. You haven't missed much just now. There've only been a couple of scoping meetings to decide what this particular group might do. So you're starting right at the start of it. Okay. I will now just quickly ask before I wrap up whether any of my fellow co-chairs have anything that they want to add to this session. I will take that as a no. Okay, so just before we finish up, I'd like to say a big thanks to all of the different people who've contributed to the FAIR for Research software working group so far. Paula has gone through to check exactly how many people this is, and there are 182 different people who have contributed in some way to the work so far, which is amazing for a community effort. I'd particularly like to thank the present and past steering committee members for coordinating this wide range of activities. It's really important, but also I understand that the amount of effort it takes to lead a group or facilitate a discussion. So I really do thank everyone who's been involved in putting together the materials and slides and presentations for this particular session, and also helping out behind the scenes, all of the things that you don't see. And finally, a big thanks to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and the Wellcome Trust for their support for this work. We receive funding to help us do this type of community engagement, and without their support, we couldn't go to as many of these different events to make sure that the community are a central part of the development and adoption of the FAIR for Research software principles. So lastly, I would just like to say thank you all for joining. Thank you so much for participating and providing so much information for us to take forward into the work of the working group. I do hope that for some of you, this will be a little kind of like eye opener, and you'll go that you want to start contributing to the working group. For others, I hope that you'll go forward and talk to your colleagues and your peers about the work of this working group and just help to spread the word of what we're doing. And if there are any things that you think we've done well, or that you think we could do better, please do provide some feedback in the notes in the section at the end. We're always interested in finding out how we can make these sorts of sessions and engagements better. And we're also interested in finding out what are the things that you find the challenges are with engaging and providing feedback on the FAIR for Research software working group work. So as a last thing for this, please do remember to go and look at some of the other wonderful sessions at the Research Data Alliance that are involved with FAIR software and the intersection of both. There is a Cure FAIR session that's running immediately after this. There is a software source code session that is running tomorrow, and you'll see that there are lots of other events to do with FAIR throughout the Research Data Alliance Plenary 17 session. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to you all, thank you to my co-hosts, and thank you to the Research Data Alliance and their team for allowing us to come here and providing us with a platform to get feedback on our work. So with that, I will say goodbye.